yes, it is.
Excellent. Well, the focus of my talk, hold on one second. The focus of my talk is the influence on French existentialism of one Nietzschean teaching in particular, and that is the teaching of the death of God. I'm going to be focused on the particular scene in the gay science where he shatters his lantern and gives up on the prospect of educating the people whom he meets in the marketplace. So this is the famous passage where the madman appears in the marketplace, asking at first what has happened to God, and he receives the answer from those who are gathered in the marketplace that they ridicule him, that God has gotten lost, God needs a minder, and that sort of thing. And then he informs them that in fact they have killed God, and he implicates not only himself, but everyone present in this deed. He ends by saying, as I say here, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. So the first question I'd like to go over very quickly is, who is this madman? And I think the standard reception, especially in the Anglophone world, is that the madman speaks for Nietzsche. I would like to call this into question because I don't think, in fact, that the madman is issuing a Nietzschean teaching, but rather a perversion of Nietzschean teaching. So the first thing that we note is that when Nietzsche was drafting the gay science, the madman passage, which became section 125, actually included the figure of Zarathustra. And Zarathustra, as we know, experienced similar difficulties teaching in the marketplace, misjudging his audiences and needing to calibrate the mode of delivery. The second thing that we note is that there's an obvious reference here to Diogenes the cynic, the philosopher who carried a lantern into the marketplace in search either of a genuine human being or, as the legend has it, an honest human being. The title of the section, The Madman, is probably a reference to Plato, who believed that Diogenes was a Socrates gone mad. The third reference that I'd like to make is to the ugliest man whom Zarathustra meets. The ugliest man is an individual who has murdered God and then recoiled from this deed. And what's fascinating about this exchange between Zarathustra and the ugliest man is that the ugliest man confirms that the promise of eternal redemption is no longer worth the 24/7 surveillance that he feels from this God. So it is the stream of recognition coming his way from God that the ugliest man finds to be intolerable. The fourth thing I'd like to point out is that the madman, as portrayed in this section, is both an actor and a performer. Nietzsche's famous or favorite term of disapprobation is Schauspieler, a purveyor of vulgar entertainment. He uses this noun to describe, for instance, Socrates and Wagner. The fifth point I'd like to make, and this I think gets to the point that Nietzsche really wants us to understand, is that the madman, in addition to pretending to be mad, is also a lunatic. He's genuinely mad, and he's been driven to his insanity by the burden of responsibility. Finally, the question that I raised at the beginning, is the madman Nietzsche's spokesperson or Nietzsche's case study? In the end, what I want to say is that both things are true, that the madman faithfully conveys the teaching of the death of God, but then misconstrues this teaching in a way that Nietzsche finds to be emblematic of how this teaching is likely to be received. Now I'd like to take a quick look at the narrative and dramatic structure here. What's going to happen, I'm going to show you the precise point at which French existentialism takes off from Nietzsche's insight into the death of God. And one of the points I'll be making here today is that French existentialism actually has the correct interpretation of Nietzsche's understanding of the death of God. So first of all, what happens in the setting is essentially a confidence game. The madman provokes the unbelievers, the atheists in the audience, by announcing that God is missing. The madman professes to have lost someone important, and then the onlookers respond as expected with an intimation of their own. This is a setup. The madman knows exactly, or believes he knows exactly, what has happened to God. The second stage in the dramatic structure is the first Jeremiad, in which the madman issues an accusation and an allegation. The accusation is, of course, what we've already seen, that God is dead and that we, all of us, have murdered God. The third stage, the madman moves to an intensification of his Jeremiad, exhorting the marketplace onlookers to begin to understand the magnitude of the deed that they have performed. It's a deed, by the way, that they have no recollection of performing. And what's interesting here is that the madman outlines a division of labor, in which the madman claims his role in responding to the death of God is simply to inform others of this. Beyond that, nothing more could or should be expected of him. The fourth stage in the development is what I call a disengagement. The audience recoils from the madman. They display hostility and concern, suspecting him to be a lunatic and not merely a performer pretending to be a lunatic. At this point, the madman extinguishes his lantern. Now, I'm going to be coming back to this fourth stage in the next slide. Then the madman moves on to his rationalization, which is entirely famous, where he says, "I have simply come too early. No one is prepared to hear what I have to say." And what he believes is the result of this is that his role in exploring and responding to the death of God has been sufficient. He needn't do anything more than to wait for an audience that will receive what he has to say. In the sixth stage of the dramatic structure, we find the madman harassing the believers and the theists in the church. And I'm always reminded in this passage of Faust, or Dr. Faustus, who, when selling his soul for unlimited power, can't think of anything better to do than to play tricks on priests and popes and that sort of thing. So we get a sense of how aimless and how unfocused the madman is in this final stage. I'm going to focus now on what I called stage 4. This is the disengagement. The audience recoils in alarm, suspecting the madman to be a lunatic in addition to pretending to be a lunatic. The madman extinguishes his lantern. Now, according to the madman, the enlightenment he wishes to provide, ostensibly with respect to the death of God, is not currently possible, for his auditors are not yet apprised of their deed. He has done all that he can do. His lantern is of no use to him, so he smashes it to bits. And this is obviously the point of departure, where the madman cannot be considered a Diogenes figure. Diogenes did not give up on his own unorthodox pursuit of enlightenment. In pretending to take responsibility for the murder of God, that's what the madman is doing in this passage. The madman, in fact, takes no responsibility whatsoever for navigating the aftermath of the death of God. So this is actually a very clever move here on the part of the madman to accept an indictment of himself as the murderer of God, so that he can take no responsibility at all for what's about to happen. This has been his goal all along, to be free of the burden of responsibility. And this is what I think Nietzsche's diagnosis of the situation is. He prematurely relinquishes his lantern. He does not want to see what the lantern will illuminate. He does not want to be a subject in the precise sense that was made prominent in the philosophies of French existentialism. Now I want to have a look at the madman's lantern. It's carried by the madman as a theatrical prop. In other words, he's not seriously interested in conducting his own investigation of what everyone understands to be the case. The lantern is emblematic of a desire for a non-redundant intensification of current efforts associated with the project of enlightenment. Now, Diogenes was often ridiculed for carrying a lantern in the light of day, but he actually had something in mind. He wanted to be able to shed light on what the light of day does not reveal. So we move to the second point. What appears in the light of day is neither self-evident nor fully disclosive. Light needs to be shed as well on the conditions under which the light of day both illuminates and obscures. Why do we see what we see? And is there more to be seen than meets the eye? This is the sense in which Nietzsche would regard himself as a champion of the cynic philosophy, his intention to shed light on what everybody believes they see very clearly. Number three, in the context of the madman's marketplace performance, the lantern promises insight into the meaning of the death of God. Rather than fulfill this promise, the madman shatters his lantern, pretending that there is nothing more to see or to know. But this response, and here's where I want to emphasize the deviation of the madman from Nietzsche, this response is particular to the madman. It's particular to, it's symptomatic of his illness. Other seekers carrying other lanterns may yet divine the meaning of the death of God. So just because the madman is no longer interested in figuring this out doesn't mean that there is nothing to figure out. So this is now what I would take to be the closest we come to Nietzsche's diagnosis of the madness of the madman. This is a famous passage from the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals. In this psychical cruelty, what he's talking about here is a cruelty exerted against oneself. In this cruelty there resides an insanity of the will, which is absolutely unexampled. The will of man to find himself guilty and reprehensible to a degree that can never be atoned for. Oh, this insane, pathetic beast. What ideas he has, what unnaturalness, what paroxysms of nonsense, what bestiality of thought erupts as soon as he is prevented just a little from being a beast indeed. Thus we arrive at what I take to be Nietzsche's diagnosis of the madman as a particular type, as an individual who delivers what Nietzsche believes is going to be a fairly typical understanding of the death of God. So the madman has glimpsed or intuited the event of the death of God, and he has recoiled from the enormity of the responsibility he correctly associates with this event. His goal is to exempt himself from any share in the task of determining an appropriate response to the death of God. And this is what the French existentialists are going to pick up on. The madman would rather be condemned as the murderer of God than seek the recognition of worthy others. His place in the cosmos is fixed. So now we can have a look at what the madman gets right. In other words, the way in which he is in fact a faithful spokesperson for Nietzsche, and what the madman gets wrong. What he gets right is that God is dead, and that the resulting convulsions and dislocations have only just begun. We have entered a transitional epoch, he understands that. The responsibilities associated with navigating the post-theistic cosmos are both enormous and daunting, he understands that. And his Jeremiad may yet prove to be prophetic. In other words, he may be correct in believing that the death of God is going to plunge the earth and humanity into an intolerable chaos. Now, here's what the madman gets wrong from Nietzsche's point of view. He and we are not the murderers of God. The death of God is not a deed, so we need not attempt to identify the guilty doers. The task of crafting an appropriate response to the death of God need not wait for the event to inform the popular consciousness. This is the point that the madman was making when he said that he had come too early. Finally, his Jeremiad is as yet premature and unwarranted. In other words, Nietzsche is saying it may turn out that the cataclysms involved in the death of God will be fatal, but we don't know that yet, and we shouldn't act as if we do. So what then is the death of God, according to Nietzsche? Now, this is my language, not Nietzsche's, so I apologize for that. The death of God is the collapse, as right now it's gradual, of what I call the moral, ascetic, metaphysical magisterium, that is, the guiding network of interlocking beliefs and values that has presided over the development of Western or European civilization for the past several millennia. God, or the term God, thus functions as a kind of metonym. It's easy enough to get distracted by the scandal involved in Nietzsche's teaching of the death of God, but he actually means to offer an identifiable and serious philosophical diagnosis, which actually is much more comprehensive than an attack on religion or theology. And we get some of this when Nietzsche returns to the second edition of The Gay Science in 1887 in a passage that I think is meant to reference the Madman. What Nietzsche says is that he finds the meaning of our cheerfulness, Heiterkeit. This is one of the holiest words in the Nietzschean lexicon. The greatest event, namely that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe. And what Nietzsche is saying here is that he looks around at himself and those who are like him, he doesn't name them, and he says, we're cheerful. We are not having the response that the Madman predicted. Now, the Madman may still turn out to be correct, but as of this moment, our cheerfulness is an indication that the death of God is an event that is in principle survivable by human beings. So what does Nietzsche mean by calling it an unbelievable belief? He has in mind that the belief in God is not worthy anymore of categorical trust. It no longer serves as a centerpiece or fulcrum. It is unable any longer to command immediate and undivided respect, and it is vulnerable to challenge, skepticism, demotion, and etc. What Nietzsche notices is that although many, most in fact, continue to believe, that they now hedge their bets. They turn also to science and to secularism for the redemption that they formerly located only in their theistic belief. So now I'm getting closer to the question of what the French existentialists pick up on. What does the Madman fear? What makes him insane with guilt? And the question that he asks that is most telling in his Jeremiad is the following. Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of this deed? The answer is yes, that's exactly what has to happen. But along the way, we need to understand what it would mean for us to become gods in our own right. The Madman fears the responsibilities and opportunities that attend subjectivity, which the French correctly understand to be the capacity to originate streams of recognition of one's own and to deflect or challenge the streams of recognition launched by others. Rather than launch and maintain his own narrative, which he knows will be contested, the Madman claims for himself an objective or thing-like subject position. As the admitted murderer of God, he is beyond redemption and so beyond expectation. Now, it seems to me that the focus on the Madman's lantern allows us to identify three influential traditions coming out of the Nietzschean insight. The first is that of psychoanalysis. Obviously, Freud is an example here, but also figures like Marcuse, who tried to bring forward some of the Nietzschean insights that were buried in Freud's theory. So psychoanalysis sheds light on the unconscious springs and levers of human behavior, accounting for the persistence of self-limiting narratives, cycles of repetition, insanity along the lines of what we see in the Madman. There's also the tradition of critical theory, which sheds light on the hidden and largely denied costs of relying on a particular model of reason and enlightenment, accounting for science as a rival and self-deceived articulation of myth. And then leading me into the topic for today, there's also the tradition of existentialism, which sheds light on the internal orienting structure of subjectivity, accounting for the freedom of subjects and the burdens associated with an awareness of freedom. So I'm turning now to the French heirs to the Madman's lantern. These are philosophers who, given their emphasis on subjectivity, have effectively taken up the madman's lantern to conduct an analysis, a disclosure of the situation after the death of God. I'm going to be talking about four figures here. I'm well aware, by the way, that Samuel Beckett was not himself French, but he did write in French and lived in France for most of his adult life. So I'm going to include him in here because I think he fits naturally within this lineage. As this subject here indicates, I'm going to be focusing on the French insight into subjectivity in excess of self. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre famously notes or claims that we are condemned to be free. And I think that we get a sense here of what the madman was up against. The madman understood that it would be better for him if he could be recognized as the murderer of God than to be condemned to the freedom that he knew was coming his way. Being and Nothingness is, of course, an exercise in existential phenomenology. Sartre was concerned to show that subjects are active participants in the structuring of experience. Subjects encounter and navigate a world that already holds meaning for them. There are, in fact, two roles for subjectivity that emerge in the book. The first is subjects are the source or origin of objectifying streams of recognition. In other words, they take on the role that formerly was monopolized by God. And then second, they are the source or origin of a dominant narrative about the world of experience. And Sartre, in fact, talks about the desire to be God, to launch a narrative that cannot be contested. He draws the very famous distinction between the ontological distinction between two modes of being, the non-conscious and the conscious entities, positing the human being to be an uneasy or ambiguous combination of the two. Later on in the book, he introduces the ontological mode of being for others. And this is what's going to occupy me for the rest of my presentation. The subject becoming aware that he, she, or they exist as an object for others. The combination of being a subject and an object simultaneously in a shifting field of streams of recognition is what makes the madman crazy. Again, Sartre, the good news in Being and Nothingness is that God no longer watches over us, judges us, and makes us feel guilty. The bad news is other subjects watch over us, judge us, and make us feel guilty, and they refuse to acquiesce to our desire to be God. Each subject wishes to impose its narrative and its grid of recognition onto the world. Each subject wishes to be the only subject, turning all other would-be subjects into objects. The desire to be God as the expression of a desire to control one's situation and launch an uncontested narrative can quickly morph into what Sartre famously called bad faith. We may control our situation, or we may gain a feeling of control if we accept the demeaning streams of recognition that wash over us, that is, if we voluntarily become the things that others wish us to become. In short, and this is the Nietzschean point that they're carrying forward, there is power, or at least the feeling of power, in powerlessness, which is the formula or the script for what Nietzsche calls the slave revolt in morality. I turn now to the play No Exit. Hell is other people, we are told. Why? Because they are subjects in their own right, and so sources of contesting streams of recognition. They too desire to be God and frustrate our desire to be God. Here you can see why the madman would have preferred to be known as the murderer of God than to subject himself to the hell that is encoded in the field of intersubjectivity. Any other subject can trouble our wish to impose our favored narrative on the world and determine the ways in which we are recognized by others. This also means that we become conscious of ourselves as objects and so as potentially victims of the recognition of others. How we are seen by others determines who or what we think we are, the gaze of the others potentially validating, but almost always objectifying. It lies beyond our control in any event. I want to identify two scenes that I think are uniquely Nietzschean. The first scene is the one in which Estelle wishes to be reminded of her physical beauty as she applies her lipstick. She wants to get her lipstick on straight. Inez offers to serve as a mirror, and so as a thing, so that she might remind Estelle of the power of recognition she holds over her. By simply positing the appearance of a blemish on Estelle's face, Inez asserts the conditional priority of her subjectivity. The second scene is the one toward the end of the play. The door to their shared room or cell suddenly flies open. Despite having claimed boldly that he would leave them if possible, Joseph decides to remain with Estelle and Inez. The implication is that a familiar situation is preferable to an unfamiliar or unknown alternative, even if the familiarity of the situation is produced and maintained by negative streams of recognition. Joseph actually prefers being recognized by Estelle and Inez as a coward, and so as a determinate thing, to being known as a free and identity constituting subject. Move now to Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex. God, this is in many respects the most Nietzschean of the books I'm going to be talking about. God may be dead, but the historical, social, political, and legal forces responsible for securing divine authority remain mostly intact. The sexism and misogyny associated with divine recognition, thereby designating woman as other, thus survive the death of God. Those subjects who are recognized as partaking of a second or secondary or derivative sex are not likely to feel liberated, and certainly not in the short term, by the death of God. This places them in a situation of double jeopardy. Members of the second sex will suffer not only from the demeaning streams of recognition to which they are subjected, which they are also likely to internalize, but also from the self-contempt that arises in the wake of a perceived failure to capitalize on the death of God. Despite acknowledging, like as Sartre did, that existence precedes essence, Beauvoir notes that the shared experience of members of the second sex will suggest otherwise. With respect to the most enduring of conventions rooted in archaic prejudice, the force of historical social construction will be virtually indistinguishable from that of natural law, divine decree, or cosmological design. Again, the insight here is that God may be dead, but the structures that were put in place to enforce divine authority will survive the death of God. Finally, Beauvoir thus takes very seriously the tenacity of the social forces associated by Nietzsche with the processes of what he calls habituation and acculturation, through which one's identity and agency have been formed. She thus accounts for the persistence and seeming permanence of the subordinate status assigned to the second sex. 6, hence the need, as documented by Nietzsche, to unlearn the habits, customs, and routines into which subjects have been habituated. This is what Nietzsche calls the revaluation of all values, a recentering of the valuing and evaluating prerogative. This is what he talks about in his own case in Ecce Homo. He talks about the importance of having unlearned all of the toxic habits that had made him sick in the first place. Number 7, eliminating the secondary and derivative status of the second sex may take centuries to accomplish, owing to the sheer weight and sedimentation of historical precedent. And finally, here we are reminded of a task of similar magnitude and ambition in Nietzsche's own writing. In the book Beyond Good and Evil, he talks about a task that he assigns to his best readers, the task of translating humanity back into nature, and thereby restoring what he calls the eternal basic text of Homo Natura. I turn now to Camus. He's a philosopher of absurdism. Absurdism is the philosophical position that it is human nature to seek an intensity of meaning and a permanence of value that are simply incompatible with the cosmos as we know and experience it. It is human nature to want, to expect, or to demand the cosmos to conform to our wishes and to vouchsafe our commitments. We encounter the absurd when our natural desire for meaning and value collides with an intractable state of affairs or conditions of our existence. The absurd thus names the potentially debilitating experience of living and striving in a world that is indifferent to us and our needs. And this is one of the points that is derived from Nietzsche's teaching of the death of God, that the death of God coincides with the rise of an experience of absurdity. Living well and achieving authenticity oblige us to embrace absurdity as a permanent and non-negotiable feature of our experience. We continue to strive even though we are fully aware that the cosmos at large does not notice, much less approve of our efforts. And here the figure of Sisyphus is often noted as a sort of Nietzschean influence. Rather than talk about the myth of Sisyphus, I'm going to talk a bit about The Plague, the novel from 1947. The Plague belongs to what's known as the second cycle of Camus' authorship, in which he explores the possibility of a life lived in open rebellion. That's the theme of the second cycle, under the sign of Prometheus, against the absurdity of human existence, as represented in the novel by the onset of the plague. While some or many of the citizens retreat or recoil from the plague that strikes Oran, placing their lives on hold until they die or the quarantine ends, the two central characters treat the plague and the ensuing quarantine of Oran as the conditions under which meaning may be created and amplified. The formation of the sanitation squads represents a refusal to allow the plague to dictate and consume its members' lives. Yes, the business of sanitation places the squad members in the zone of the disease, thus raising perhaps dramatically the likelihood of contagion and death. But the business of sanitation also allows the squad members to control the narrative of their lives and to take ownership of the meaning they create. Rather than hide, temporize, or simply wait until the plague claims them, they resolve to live, to make new friends, and to face death honestly. On authenticity, Camus' position is that every moment of our lives presents a unique, non-repeatable opportunity to make or add to the meaning we naturally seek for ourselves. At the conclusion of the novel, Dr. Vieux reveals himself as the narrator of the book. He also discloses a nugget of absurdist wisdom of which his fellow citizens are happily unaware, and that is that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it would be folly, fantasy to believe that we have vanquished the plague once and for all. And at the end, his friend Jean Theroux reminds us or tells us that each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. The good man, the man who infects hardly anyone, is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention.
Daniel, you have heard me. You have got another 5 minutes. Huh?
5 minutes, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The final figure I want to discuss in this lineage is Beckett, as I mentioned earlier, not himself a Frenchman, but he lived in France for most of his adult life. And in fact, he wrote Waiting for Godot in French and then translated it himself into English. The first insight that I want to discuss is his understanding of nihilism or as inertia. The death of God ushers in a transitional epoch. We are free to set a course for ourselves, but we are habituated to wait for someone else to do so for us. That someone else could be God, it could be Godot, it could be anyone. The important point for Beckett is that we are habituated to wait for someone who has an authority that we do not claim for ourselves. In the play itself, even seeking shelter for the night is too much trouble. We find the central characters talking, making promises, making plans, but they never follow through on them. They're waiting for someone else to offer them the authority to do so. The spirit of gravity weighs heavily upon us. That's Nietzsche's term. It is easier and more familiar to us to wait for another who may not come than to work to achieve escape velocity from our habituated rhythms and routines. Bad faith is both normal and virtually irresistible. We fancy ourselves to be free individuals, and here there are references to the characters of Vladimir, Estragon, and Pozzo, but we remain in the thrall of the slave morality that has formed us. The second point, nihilism as boredom. Despite our pretensions to freedom, we can neither affirm nor renounce our reliance on a superlative, godlike stream of recognition. Why is this? Again, we've been habituated to accept as normal a position of waiting, of subordination, of service to an unknown other whom we allow to control our destiny. We have become contented slaves. We may complain about waiting, but we don't do anything about it. And in fact, much of the dialogue of the play is occupied in chronicling the bickering and the posturing, the pontificating of the characters. That's because these have become our primary ways of remaining attached to familiar people and routines. And here I'm reminded of both Kierkegaard and Heidegger on the mediating properties of chatter in a decadent epoch where idle chatter takes the place of reasonable discourse. The final point I'd like to make here about Beckett is his understanding of nihilism as self-contempt. The characters can achieve transient flights of freedom and passion. They occasionally make very good speeches and impassioned vows. But for the most part, they are locked into the drudgery of waiting for someone who may never arrive. They vow to rebel, to wait no longer, but they vow to no avail. Only the character Lucky is bound by a rope. This is why, according to Beckett, this is why he is lucky. He has no expectations, which means he suffers from no dashed expectations. The others are bound by choice in the face of the crushing inertia. Awareness of the death of God thus issues an invitation to self-contempt. To know oneself to be voluntarily unfree leads to what Kierkegaard called despair, wishing not to be oneself. Vladimir and Estragon vow to hang themselves if Godot does not come the next day, but we suspect at the end of the play they will not honor this or any other vow. Thank you very much.